Hi there. Welcome to the podcast this month. Before we get into the meat and the introduction and all of the things in this podcast today or this month, I'd like to take a moment to recognize and honor the Indigenous communities in Canada. As you are aware, recently at the Kamloops Residential School, 215 children's bodies were discovered in a mass burial site on the residential school grounds. I would be remiss to start this podcast without recognizing and honoring the grief and ongoing trauma caused by residential schools in Canada. The BVCFA offers our support for our Indigenous staff and learners. And we want you to know that we will offer our support in any way that you need it from us. This is a heavy thing, and it's very important that we take time to honor and to recognize and to realize and understand that this trauma is ongoing. It's not history yet. We are still living with the trauma. And so I want to encourage all of us, all of you, to continue to have our Indigenous peoples in your mind when you're thinking about inclusion and allyship. And that's a big part of what our podcast is about today, is inclusion, allyship, giving space and giving voice to people who need to be heard. With that in mind, here's the episode. Well, hello folks, and welcome back to You're on Mute, the BVCFA podcast. I am so happy you decided to join me again today. I am your host, Dara McKay, and have I got an exciting one for you this time. Today we're talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and one that's also extremely important: inclusion. Since June is globally recognized Pride Month in many countries, my focus today is namely on the inclusion of LGBTQ2S+ individuals and issues in our classrooms, and how we as faculty practice this type of inclusion in different ways. I've got some great perspectives for you to hear today. I've got some brilliant faculty members from different areas. And so I have a great variety of voices to showcase on the podcast today to talk about inclusion. Our first guest today is going to be Christina Musa, who's an instructor in the School of Global Access. Then I have Matthew Wengrowicz, who is an instructor in social work, and that's going to be a really interesting conversation from his perspective there. After Matthew, we're going to hear from Emily Albertson, also from the School of Global Access, and how she deals with tough topics that come up in her classroom from her learners. Then we have Alex May from Early Learning and Childcare. We have Austin Deck, a learner in nursing, and also happens to be part of the SABVC. And then last but not least, and I promise you're going to want to stick around for this one, and I know I said that last time, but this one's going to be really fun. My good friend Jordan Witzel is going to be joining us on the podcast today, and you might know that name, formerly a meteorologist for Global News. Jordan is a community member. He's also a member of the media. He's an advocate. He's an ally, and he's one of my best friends. And so we're going to have an awesome conversation with Jordan. Now, I saved him for last because he comes from outside of the college, but you're going to like what he has to say. And he brings a really interesting background from sociology as well. So we've got some great perspectives on the podcast today. I'm going to tell you, you're going to want to set aside some time to listen to this one today. Play it out over a few different lunch hours. Go for a walk. grab a nice cup of iced coffee because, man, it's hot, and stay tuned for these great conversations. First up, though, what's up in the FA, you ask? Well, here you have it. Segment 1. BVCFA election results are in. All right. So, acclaimed is our president, Penny Marcotte. So we're super happy to have her continue on in that role. We think she does an amazing job. We have a new treasurer. That's going to be Andreas Lambronudis. I really hope I pronounced your name properly, Andreas, and welcome aboard. And a huge thank you to Brenda Thomas, who is our outgoing treasurer. Brenda, you have done an incredible job and you will be missed. One position is still vacant, and I want you to think about this. VP Professional Affairs is vacant. If you have a passion for professional development, if you want to lead the pack, if you are interested in Wise and Well sessions and want to continue on in that legacy, I recommend that you put your name forward for VP Professional Affairs. Reach out to the BVCFA if you're interested in the VP Professional Affairs job. Lindsay Bonifant has been in that role, and she's done an incredible job and is ready to pass on the torch. Newly elected academic council members, Heather Martin, Mary Smith, Ryan Weber, and we have a vacant seat for an alternate. If you are interested in being a part of academic council or the professional affairs, please reach out to any executive member, BVCFA, at bbcfa.com. So our continuing executive members, VP Operations, Matt Kriz, VP Negotiations, Phil Flagel, VP Communications, me, Dara. Past executive continues to be Trevor McIver, and our Board of Governors representative, Jeff Clemens. We want to, of course, show our appreciation again for VP Professional Affairs, outgoing Lindsay Bonifant, Treasurer Brenda Thomas, and our Chair of Academic Council Faculty Caucus, Jennifer Rousseau. We thank you so much for your service, and we're very pleased to have been able to, I'm very pleased to have been able to work with you all. So that's what's up in the FA. What else have we got going on for you? Website progress. So a small team of us on the executive, including myself, Jeff Clemens, and Lindsay Fairbrother, have moved past the copywriting style stage, and now we're on to the site mapping. And that's going to be really interesting. The goal is to have the website up and running before the end of August. FDP, we have a new faculty development process, and we're going to have a chat with Flora and Landis, two wonderful faculty members who have really spearheaded this. So stay tuned for some information on the new FDP faculty development process. I can tell you it's fantastic. I'd like to welcome Landis Jackson and Flora Mahdavi to the podcast this episode. They're here to talk to us a little bit about the FDP for faculty. Welcome, Landis and Flora.
Hello. Thank you. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity. And I will say, I have started the process of the FDP, and I've been really appreciating how in control I am of this whole process. So I think our purpose today is just to let faculty know a little bit more about it, and the process and the pros, and how we can get started on it. Is there anything that you'd like to sort of start with?
Sure. So maybe we could start from the beginning.
Yeah.
How this came to be. There were some focus groups that were held and facilitated by HR Activate, which is an external HR company that facilitated some of this work as well. And during those focus groups, faculty got to express what they wanted out of a review process. And so there was some really key points that came out of those focus groups. And then based on those, based on the report from the focus groups and those key findings, a steering committee was put together to create this process and get us to where we are right now. I could go into the key findings of the focus group, or I could let Landis fill in the blanks.
I was just going to add a great overview, Flora, and that Flora and I were privileged to be asked to sit on this committee as faculty representatives. And so we are proud of the process that we've come up with, and it's much more engaging than what people have experienced before. So with that, Flora, back to you, and you can maybe talk about the purpose and the parts of it, and I'm going to add in when I can think of additional comments.
Thank you, Landis. So the key findings were that faculty wanted this to be celebratory and dialogical. They wanted to have a dialogue. They wanted this opportunity to allow them to have a conversation with their managers. And I'm going to say manager because they hold different titles. Basically, they could be directors, associate deans, or whatever title that they may have in that department. But they wanted to be able to speak to their managers and have a dialogue about what they do and what works for them and what doesn't. They wanted this to be flexible because faculty do very different things in different schools and departments. So a performance appraisal that was with a cookie cutter approach wasn't working for everybody, and it had proved to be quite cumbersome. So they wanted flexibility, they wanted dialogue, and they wanted this to be celebratory and developmental rather than a punishment or something that you would be dreading. So those were the key findings, and I believe what we have at the end is meeting those requirements. And as Landis said, this is something that I feel very strongly about and happy to share with everyone else.
I'm just going to add one more point, Flora, and that is that we also really wanted the process to be driven by the faculty member, not to be a process that is rolled out from the leadership team or human resources, but rather that the faculty can drive the process. And so we will talk a little bit about timing of how often that these conversations or this process can be engaged in.
Being driven by faculty is a requirement for the process to be actually developmental. There is literature and research behind this that, for example, if a teaching observation is done because a manager is mandating that observation is going to be a lot more have the spirit of assessment and appraisal rather than development and how can I grow and how can I get better. So that's, again, quite important. So it's part of being developmental. It means that the faculty needs to drive this, take initiative, and get it started.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think about that idea of performance appraisals in the past as opposed to the process I'm going through right now, where I'd have an official person come in and watch a lesson in my classroom, and I'd have to submit my lesson plan, and which was never a bad thing. I always, as a teacher who is a learner, I always enjoy the feedback that I would get. But I also felt like I had to be something that I wasn't always in the natural state of my classroom. So I'd have a more prescribed lesson plan than I normally would have done. And, I'm trying to think of, okay, what can I show them that's really cool? And, and that kind of stuff. Whereas in this process, I think in terms of what the toolkit, one of the ones is peer assessment, peer observation, not assessment, which I think is kind of a cool idea, because you can have a colleague that you respect and trust come in, and then you can have a conversation about what they observed. And I think that's actually mutually beneficial for the person observing and the person teaching in that moment, right? I love that idea of it being developmental instead of like an assessment. I think that's a huge switch.
Yeah, it's actually a culture switch.
Yeah.
And I think we are really proud that it's progressive, and it will really allow development in the faculty because they're driving the process. I think also adding on to what you were mentioning is that the peer that you're going to ask, or that you may ask to come into your class, may not even be in your department.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you've come to recognize them through maybe committee work or whatever that you've done, and you've come to respect them, and then you invite them into your class, and that's a whole new dimension than what we've had before. And that's another piece, I think, that's exciting about this process.
Yeah, I think connecting with people that don't necessarily do exactly what you do
Yes.
is also really, really useful.
Yeah.
In so many ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how can faculty go about getting started on their development process?
The faculty just need to reach out to their manager and indicate that they are interested in starting in this process. To be respectful of the managers, we are asking for faculty to be flexible, because maybe their manager is already involved in 4, 5, 6 of these FDP plans. So the timing might be a little delayed, but the first step is for the faculty to reach out to the manager to say, we're interested in getting involved in this process, and starting a conversation with your manager about what will this look like.
Mm-hmm. And I think that too, looking through the forms, when I reached out to my associate dean to say, hey, I'd like to start this process, let's see what it's like. The very first steps are all the celebratory steps,
Mm-hmm.
thinking through like what do you want to celebrate in the last period of time. And I went back to 2018 because I think that's the last time I had a formal appraisal. And I thought, oh gosh, it's been a while with everything, of course. And it was kind of an interesting piece because the last time I had a performance appraisal was before we shifted the whole structure. So my current associate dean wasn't the one who was over me at that time. It wasn't the person I was working with on these. And it actually provided a space and an opportunity for me and my direct manager to actually get to know each other a little bit more on a professional level, and not just like, hi, in the hallway. It was like, you know, this is what I do. And then she could see and celebrate the things that I do with me, which was a really, really great way to start, I think.
Yeah. And it's a great way to recognize your faculty by listening to what they are happy about in their career.
Yeah.
Not making assumptions about what is someone really proud about. And so that was it on purpose, that we created the process and the forms that way. We wanted to start off with the celebrations of what the faculty member has done.
Yeah, it definitely does seem to work that way. And so where can faculty access the forms?
The forms are all placed on College Connect, and so under the menu that says working here, you will find faculty development process. The form is there. There are a few introductory videos. There are short videos that are just saying what this process is about. Also, I think when going through the forms, just be mindful that you don't have to complete everything. In fact, the basis is the first couple of sections, which is what you're celebrating, what you've achieved that you want to talk about, and perhaps a couple of goals, a few goals, depending on how how detailed you go with those. But then there are different tools that you can pick from and say, for example, maybe you want to really showcase something very extraordinary that you've done. So you want to create a portfolio, and the portfolio, we haven't, on purpose, we have not given a template for that. Instead, we have left it to the faculty to really showcase. Maybe it's only one project that they want to showcase, and that's all that goes into that portfolio. Maybe they want to have a peer observation, and the peer observation, it mostly happens outside these forms. So you get your peer, whether it's your program chair, somebody from a different department, another colleague who's senior to you or has more experience or you trust, You could also go to the learning design consultants and ask one of them to do peer observation, because their process is also very confidential. But then the only thing that you record in FDP process is that you've had a peer observation, you've met, you've had feedback, and you're good to move on. The details of that, you stay in control on how much you're going to share on that. The other tool is goal setting. So if you want to get more specific on your goals and you want to focus more on that, that's another thing you could do. Or you could use learner feedback from formal end of semester evaluation that has happened, and maybe you want to have a conversation around those. But it's really your choice what to pick and which area to focus on. These tools are to start the conversation and go from there. So look up the forums on College Connect and think about which of these would perhaps suit what you want to do with your development process
at this time, because you may use different forms the next time. And that was just a point that I was going to make, is we are suggesting every 3 years that faculty be involved in this process. Not every year, but every 3 years. And so you can certainly document for yourself what's gone on in those 3 years, but you don't need to have a formal conversation with your manager. Just every 3 years is what we are looking at. And then the 2 parts of the process will be filed in your particular file in Human Resources. They will do the administrative piece of that and go from there.
Awesome. Well, this is such great information. And I also, in talks of building our new Faculty Association website, we have kind of thought that it would be a great idea to put the forums accessible on our faculty website as well, just because faculty really does own this process, right?
And right, exactly. Great, so great idea.
That website will be available. We should launch in August, and there should be a place on that website that holds the forms as well. Right. Is there anything else that you feel like you need to mention before we wrap up?
I think one key question that comes up every now and then, and we should mention it, is that all faculty qualify for this.
Yes.
Whether you're continuous, temporary, or casual. Now, so reach out to your manager. Doesn't matter the type of your contract. If I was a casual who was hoping to become temporary or become permanent, then I would definitely pick this up, because you do want to have these kind of conversations with your manager. If I was somebody who was very close to retirement, I would pick this up, because maybe I do want to really highlight some of the great things I've done. This is a good process to do that. If I was a new faculty at any stage of my career, from other places to Bow Valley, or just new to teaching altogether, I would pick this up, because it would give me a channel to talk about where I could perhaps go and start those cognitive wheels turning on where am I heading with my career. So this will have something for everybody, or so we hope.
Yeah, it seems like that would be the case too, because if you're brand new or you're just starting, you focus on the going forward. You focus on maybe goal setting and things like that. And if you've been here a while, you can focus a little on the celebratory. And I agree. There's definitely something for everyone.
Yeah. We are happy to hear that you're going through the process, and that you are, experiencing what we were hoping. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, always good feedback, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, I want to thank you both for letting us know a little bit more about this. And for faculty listening today, I highly recommend getting started in this process whenever you have a chance. For me, it's taken a few months to get through it, and it doesn't feel like I'm pressed for time, because it's an ongoing conversation with my associate dean. So it's been actually really enriching. I want to thank you, Landis and Flora, for joining us on the podcast today. update for you. Well, there's not much going on in bargaining, and that's what I can tell you right now. We're still in that same holding pattern, setting out all of the parameters for bargaining itself, and actual bargaining has not begun. So stay tuned for more communication on bargaining as it comes up. PAC, here's a clip from Lindsay Bonifant about what PAC is up to right now, what we have accomplished, and what is coming up for you before the end of the year, before we end for summer.
Thank you to everyone who joined us in May for Marjorie Contenti's session on meditation for health and joyful living. The recording should now be up on the BVCFA website if you have missed it. The last Wise Them All session of the year is going to be on June 21st, and it will be led by Crystal Manyfingers, who will be presenting on health and wellness from an Indigenous perspective. Please reach out to pac@bbcfa.com if you have any suggestions for next year's Wise Them All sessions, or if you would like to be a part of the PAC committee. Thank you and have a wonderful summer semester.
Okay, that's what's up in the FA. Here is segment 2, news and notes. Well, okay. Big news is, and this is old news now, I think we're returning to work in September, right? We're going back to campus, return in September with a flexible work arrangement for some faculty members has been put into place. Now, I know that the flexible work arrangement, FWA, has proven to be a little bit difficult in some areas. But it's been presented to each school by the deans, and from what I understand, the associate deans will be in charge of gathering those applications. And I'm sure that process has already been finished for many schools. So we've seen some kinks from the process, and it might look different from school to school, and there are definitely many questions that come up from the rollout of this process. As the Faculty Association, we're doing our best to navigate this new working arrangement and to see how we can help support people from that in those areas. Some more interesting news in the politics. I love politics. I'm super excited about it all the time, but here we are. Teachers and doctors in Alberta have voted through their respective professional organizations that they no longer have confidence in the ministers for education and health. This is interesting, and I would say really important to follow, because what happens in those particular public service professions certainly can affect what we do in our jobs right now at Bow Valley. So we've got a really interesting thing here, and we have high school upgrading, we have high school programming that definitely affects us. There's this whole thing, of course, I'm sure, has been triggered by this highly criticized draft curriculum and the handling of doctors' contracts during the pandemic. So you'll soon learn that I don't often miss a chance to get political, but to be fair, these two things affect us all. And whether we have kids in the education system or whether we'll teach the cohort coming through this curriculum and they're upgrading our post-secondary years, this affects post-secondary. All of this stuff trickles into one another. And so, healthcare, of course, is the single largest need in Canada right now. So, okay, that's what's going on politically, among other things. I know we could have a whole podcast series about politics in Alberta. That's what's happening. But I do think it's worth being aware of what's going on in the education sector for public education, because we certainly are going to see learners coming out of that. Some interesting development in the world of post-secondaries in Alberta. Big congratulations to Red Deer College and Grand Prairie Regional College, who have changed their statuses to polytechnics. So that's kind of a neat development. And, it was reported that both schools have hopes that this will better serve their learners and the industry in the central and northern Alberta. So exciting times for Red Deer College and Grand Prairie Regional College. That's a little tidbit of the news. Here's the notes. We're still rolling with uncertain times, but at least we know when our return to campus is. That's something we can kind of count on. There are many faculty members in a position where they don't know what they're going to be teaching or what their schedules will be like, and this is proving to be a wrench in this FWA rolled out at the beginning of this term. What that will look like is still a mystery. It's a mystery, and I, for one, am curious to hear from you about how it was rolled out in your school and how you will be dealing with the policy. As far as government is concerned, I've certainly read parts of the new curriculum, and I will say that I have some strong opinions about this. With kids in public school, as a person who's taught the old quote-unquote curriculum and grown up in the Alberta public schools under an older curriculum, I can say improvements definitely are welcome. That said, I'm not a super fan of this new draft, and if it goes through, I know as a parent, I'm going to be really concerned about what my kids are learning. That's a big deal. When it comes to doctors, I mean, I don't even know if I want to go there with the notes. Doctors literally save our lives. So maybe right now or over the past year hasn't really been the best time to mess with them. But that's my opinion. Clearly, I need you to make sure that you know and understand that my opinion does not reflect the opinions of the BVCFA as an organization. This is just me talking. Lastly, yay to Red Deer College and Grand Prairie. Well, I wish them the best of luck as they transition to their new designations as polytechnics. It's a really cool thing when people embrace change that can be beneficial. So I really do hope that this is the change for them that they're looking for and that it's a move forward. I mean, of course, I could talk about all sorts of things happening in the news right now. But you know, some good news is something that we need. So here we are. Our third segment today is not just from the faculty. I got to name it from the faculty and friends. Okay? I have a lot of guests for us today, and I promise you'll want to listen to them all because there's so much good learning in here. You want to know this all. So this is fun. I have 4 faculty members from different parts of the college. I have 1 learner from the college, and I have 1 fairly recognizable community member who has come to join us on this month's podcast. So, as I said before, June is Pride Month. And so even though BVC celebrates Pride in February, we've got our Pride Week in February, super fun. And Calgary celebrates in September. We've got our Pride Week in September. It's usually the long weekend. The world recognizes this event every year in June. June marks the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, with June 28th being Pride Day to commemorate the very first Pride March held in New York City in 1970, the year after Stonewall. This month is a time for celebration, for how far we've come in the queer community, but also to remember how far we still must go. So in that spirit, my guests today are all going to chat about how inclusion of LGBTQ2S+ content, individuals, and topics work in their classrooms and in their lives. We'll hear from a student perspective on how we can best support learners as faculty from their experience. And the community member joining us today will be talking about what we can do personally in our lives and in our communities. Our first guest today is Christina Musa. Christina teaches in the School of Global Access in the EAP program. And the reason I asked Christina to come on to the podcast today is because I have known her to be a very fierce ally of LGBTQ, and I know her work has shown a lot of progress and growth in diversity and inclusion, and she's been a huge proponent for it. So welcome to the podcast, Christina.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I think we're going to have a great conversation today. So I kind of just want to have a look at some different perspectives, and as an instructor, especially as an instructor of language and newcomers to Canada, I'm just curious what kinds of things you've done in your classroom to incorporate LGBTQ content into your courses, or even just inclusion and diversity in general.
Okay, so we our first theme in the AE2 program is multiculturalism. So I always see this as a great gateway to a wider picture of diversity and inclusion. So when we talk about multiculturalism, I want to make a connection with the students, and I want to make it at their level. Like, I want them to embrace diversity inclusion because they know it's the right thing to do, and not because I'm the teacher telling them it's the right thing to do. So typically when we start speaking about multiculturalism, I ask the students, as a new Canadian or as an international student here, how do you want other Canadians to treat you? What are your expectations of being here in Canada? And, usually I hear the things I want them, to accept me for my religion, for my culture, the fact that I'm not a native English speaker, right? And so they want to be accepted and embraced for who they are, which is always a nice segue into talking about others in Canada, particularly people who identify on the LGBTQ2S+ spectrum, right? And how they're people too, and they want to be accepted for who they are. And I often find this discussion leads them to being more open-minded about understanding, respect, diversity, inclusion. And then we talk a little bit about tolerance, and I kind of ask them, like, do you think tolerance is enough, or do we need acceptance? Right? So trying to get them to look that tolerance is the first step, but acceptance is the ultimate goal, and just realizing that we're all individuals with unique perspectives that can help develop Canada, our society, our community, and our school.
Mm-hmm. I like that you bring up the word tolerance, because I often like kind of get a bit of a yucky feeling in my stomach when I hear the word tolerance, because why should I just be tolerated? That implies that I'm not actually accepted. So I love that you bring up the idea of acceptance and bringing it to that base level of, well, you want to be accepted for who you are, so let's also extend that to the rest of the population, right?
Yes. And again, it's, I always start with respect and tolerance, but it's got to go deeper than that. And, and I talk a lot about how Canada's on the way. I think we're doing some really good things, but I still think we're sort of stuck, because we're stuck in this notion of being, well, we're colorblind and we tolerate everybody, so we're good. Everything's working, right? But we need to go beyond that, because it's in acknowledging the differences and accepting the differences, and accepting people for who they are with these differences, is that when we're really gonna take off, and we're really gonna be a country that can say, yes, we are diverse and we are inclusive.
Yeah, because it's not just enough to be like, hey, we all live here and we're happy-go-lucky, because that's not the way it goes. So kind of thinking like because of course, in a classroom, we're going to have difficult situations. We might have, and we will always have differing perspectives, opinions, beliefs. What have you found to be the best ways to broach those difficult situations when it comes to those diverse perspectives?
Oh, I love controversial topics, or topics that need to speak. I will introduce them myself, but usually I start out, I always use gender neutral language in the classroom. So when I was still married, I would speak about my spouse, and I would never say he or she. I would just say my spouse, my partner, right? And I extend that to the students as well. But I know eventually somewhere in the term, a student will ask me, well, is your spouse a man? And I would say, well, actually he is, but does it really make a difference? Because now that you know me, do you really care about that side of who I might be? And it's really interesting, because they're like, no, because we know you and we really like you. So like, you need to extend that at all times. So I do a lot of gender neutral language. I talk about pronouns. I even talk about land acknowledgement. I'm always trying to get them to remember that Canada is a big country with people from all over the place, and everyone deserves to be respected and accepted for who they are, whether it's pronouns, acknowledging, land, those sorts of things. So I bring in controversial topics. I bring in TED Talks. I bring in colleagues from faculty who are willing to share their experiences. I want those discussions to happen, and I want to talk about how we should discuss these topics respectfully, openly, and honestly. Yeah,
I think that's awesome, because I think a lot of us, myself as well, I would finish this category because I do identify as LGBTQ2S+, and there's a lot of self-preservation for me in the classroom, so I'm never quite sure, like, how open am I going to be, and how out do I get to be with this particular group? And so I do use a lot of that gender neutral language as well, right? Like I say spouse, I say they, and I talk about how they can be gender neutral singular pronoun, right? Like we can use that, and it's not bad English. It's not. So I think that's a great place to start, Christina.
Well, and hey, these days APA encourages the use of they. Yes. In their right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
To avoid that awkwardness of he or she, and I find even APA is becoming more inclusive.
Yeah.
Right. By accepting the use of they. No, I think again, I don't like, and it makes me unhappy that I get to be who I am as a cisgendered heterosexual woman. I don't have to worry about how the class is going to accept me. So this is why I want to work with our students, so that you get to feel exactly the same way 100% of the time, and not depending on what you feel in the classroom.
And I think that extends to like our learners as well, right? Yes. So then I guess that leads me to the next idea, is like, how can we as instructors in general support diverse learners in the teaching and the curriculum? What about being a good ally to LGBTQ+ learners in our classes?
I mean, I recently found, and I don't remember the name of it, but I will share it with you. I recently found some resources online about incorporating more inclusive, particularly LGBTQ2S+ content in the classroom, and I really want to take a look at that. But I do, like I said, I find, I'll go to TED Talks about these subjects. I always talk to the students about our classroom is a safe space. It is safe for every single person in the class. Mm-hmm. And, they are always safe to talk. It's always safe to speak to me about whatever they want. And so I've had students in the past who come out to me, but they're not ready to come out to their classmates. Mm-hmm. And that's understandable because, if they don't know how they're going to be accepted. So I think we need to, as a college, develop content that starts right down for our low link learners all the way to the students who are graduating from career programs, and that this content needs to be in every program. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to get, input from LGBTQ2+. And we just need to develop content that goes college-wide. It should be everywhere. Mm-hmm. I feel like I go look for it, but I shouldn't have to, right? But I've seen some steps, like the videos made for pronoun use. That's a great first step. The activities we have during Pride, these are all great steps, but how do we keep that momentum going so it goes throughout the year? Because it should be more than just a week of the year, mm-hmm. right? And it should be in every program. So
I wholeheartedly agree with that one. And I think about the Pride Week and the Pride Committee, having served on that committee for a couple of years, and it's just a group of people who are volunteering their time to, bring awareness because we care, right? So, there's funding for it and things like that, of course, but that's I love the idea of building it into our college course outcomes, like our curriculum, our base, the way we deliver everything, right?
Absolutely. Because I'm totally on board as well with the indigenization of our mm-hmm. curriculum, but also it needs to be a broader picture of diversity inclusion for those people who don't feel they fit in or don't see themselves reflected always in the learning materials.
Yeah, because it's not just LGBTQ, it's not just Indigenous, we have such a diverse population in all of our programs. I think, right? You're onto something there.
That needs to be throughout the entire college in every program throughout a student's entire learning and us as employees.
That's awesome. Yeah, awesome. I love this perspective too. And coming from a place where, we literally teach that language. One of the things that I really work on is being a proponent for teaching in that inclusive language. And that's something that we can all do, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I've really been lately trying to think about my own unconscious biases and what am I doing in the classroom, and trying to really focus on making sure my language is as inclusive as possible.
Yeah.
Which sometimes makes me stutter in class because I start to say something, no, that's not going to come out the way I want it to come out. It's not going to sound right.
Yeah.
But I think, I think we all need to really examine who we are as instructors and how we deliver our messages and how we make sure everyone in the class feels like they belong and we are not othering anyone.
I like that, not othering anyone. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Christina. We really appreciate your perspective, and I look forward to seeing what you do with your classes in the future and seeing how we work on inclusion going forward at Bow Valley College.
Thank you so much for having me, Dara. I really appreciate it.
Hey, also joining us today is Matthew Wengrowicz, from a faculty member who teaches in the social work program. Welcome to the podcast, Matthew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I think it's going to be a great discussion, and I'm super happy to get your opinion. Having worked with you on the Pride Committee, I've noticed that you are quite a wonderful advocate for LGBTQ2S+ students and for the community in general. And the nature of what you do in social work, I'm sure, really lends itself to dealing with some of these issues head on. Is that something that you would say is accurate?
Yeah, I would say so. One thing, just a note on language today for myself, I tend to just use the word queer as an umbrella term, but I also recognize that some folks prefer more specific terminology. So just to note that if I'm saying queer, I am referring to the broad community of people who are LGBTQ2+, or even just questioning and not really sure where they're at in their journey. So.
That's a great point of clarification, and I think that's actually a really nice set of terminology that people can adopt in their classes as well. So, I mean, that kind of brings us into the topic right away, which is, I'm happy that you mentioned that. What brought you to adopting that type of terminology, and what other kinds of things do you use in your classroom to make sure that you're being inclusive?
Well, it's funny. For a long time, I personally identified as gay, and then I've kind of changed my language over time and now identify as queer. Queer is a reclamation term for many people in the community. I find that many folks, I would say, kind of in their 40s and older right now, may find that term very difficult, even some folks in their 30s at this point. But I'm finding with younger generations, it's often really helpful to use that term because it can be very empowering for people and feel a bit more inclusive. And so that's actually shifted my language in the classroom to using the term queer a bit more often, but also explaining how and why I'm using it, which is why I noted that at the beginning. In terms of classrooms, I think it's important to recognize that in every class that we teach, I don't think it changes from one program to another. There's going to be someone who identifies as queer in your classroom. Just statistically, it's just, there will be. Whether or not they are out and open about that is a different thing. And so I think there's some sensitivity that needs to be brought in. I'm a big believer in being out in my work. And I think that has provided a lot of opportunities for students to feel safe and open talking about their experiences. And this doesn't have to be a big thing, right? So in social work, we have cohorts that we work with for over 2 years often. And so we work with the same people all the time, but anytime I'm in a new class, I always start by introducing myself, sharing my pronouns, he, him, his, which are also in my email signature, which I think is also very important. Those small signs of affirmation for queer students can be huge, but we also don't have to make a big deal out of it. I often say, as a queer educator, I believe it's important to have an inclusive classroom environment, and I want everyone to feel like they're able to share who they are and their learning process in the classroom when you're here. And so I'm not making a big hurrah about it, but that just subtly putting it out there is often hugely helpful. And I've had several students who have come to me over the years and said that I was the first positive example of a queer person that they've been able to see. And so, or know, because oftentimes people early on in their journey are very cut off. And so even just being open and out, if you are part of the community, is often a really powerful thing for people. And it gives space. Specifically within social work, we've had several students who have started their transition in terms of gender identity in my cohorts, and having a safe person to talk to and knowing that they can trust that I will respect their pronouns, that I will respect their gender identity, can be really empowering. And we model in social work the types of behaviors we want social workers to have out in the community. And so that acceptance is really important. But it goes further than that. So the first time I meet with students, I always do a kind of a round table and have everyone introduce themselves. And I ask them specifically to share what their pronouns are. So for students, this can be a little unusual at first if they've never experienced this. I find especially with our international students, it's a little bit almost shocking at first because or shocking might not be the right word, but just confusing for folks who may have not familiarized themselves with that. So I do a quick rundown of what pronouns are and how they're used and how people can talk about that. And so our most common are obviously he, him, his, she, her, hers, or they, them, their. However, there's a lot of different ones as well out there. So it's important to just honor what students give you. And it opens up space for people to see that they're not alone in a classroom, I think, because often there's a lot of people who may be non-binary, things like that, and it gives that space just to feel like less alone in the classroom. In terms of other strategies, we use in the social work program something called the safe zone training. I'm a big fan of this, and it's actually really accessible to all instructors. So safe zone training is a free open source curriculum to teach about the queer community. It comes with like student handouts and also an instructor guide, and it's super helpful. So you don't have to feel like you need to have all the answers because it's all set up for you already. So that one can be found at thesafezoneproject.com, and it's a hugely helpful resource, especially if you're feeling a little less confident in teaching that.
I've used that Safe Zone actually from your recommendation, an excellent resource for sure. I've shared it with many of my colleagues as well.
Great, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, it goes really well. In social work, I generally run that program, and so I feel a bit more confident with it. So I do some things that other folks might not be as confident with. But depending on how you feel about it, I'm a big fan of like the high school sex ed question box, essentially, and because a lot of students are afraid to ask certain questions. So say, you can put in anything in here that you want. I don't care if you think it's silly or and I don't want you to be worried about offending people. We'll talk about it and chat about it and go through that. You will get some really challenging questions at times in there, but it's a really great opportunity to make sure you're not missing things that people don't understand, because there's going to be a wide array of understanding within a classroom. And so setting that up is also important. So letting some folks who are more comfortable with the community know that you might hear some questions that may not come across the way you're hoping they would, but we have to remember everyone's different in this, and not everyone has had a chance to learn about this subject. And so it's a really helpful thing to add in. The only other thing I would add in terms of classroom is that we talk a lot about intersectional feminism in our program, and that's a really good opportunity to talk about how we all carry different identities around with us. And it's a good opportunity to highlight that sexuality, gender expression, all of those types of things will be very different for everyone, and especially if you have different identities that align with that. My experiences as a white queer man are not going to be the same as a trans woman of color, for example. That is compounded with multiple issues, not just transphobia, but often racism and other experiences like that. So I think it's also important, if you are a queer educator, to be clear that you can't speak for the entire community. You can only speak from your lived experience.
And I think recognizing too that others bring their lived experience with them into these cohorts, right? And I love what you said there about modeling the types of behaviors and interactions that we want learners to then go out into whatever program they're going to be doing, right? The social work is a great example. I think that's that piece we can extend to everything, right? As instructors, modeling that sense of inclusion. I liked what you brought up about creating space for the learners and the question box idea. Just a great way to actually create space in a literal, physical way for the learners. Do you have any like anecdotes or stories that you can share from that particular activity, or any success stories about something that's happened in your classroom?
Recently, we had it's funny, some of these will be actually really emotional moments as an educator as well, where you just like, it hits you a little harder, and in a positive way for me. In this most recent example, recently we had a student who said that just by being open and out in my classroom and creating that space for people to be accepted and acknowledged in all of my classes, that they were able to come to terms with their gender identity as a trans student and began the transition that they were terrified to do. And I think as instructors, we have to be careful not to like go into the counseling world with students. We want to make sure people get connected to appropriate supports.
Yeah.
But we need to hold that emotional space for students and validation of that. So for many students, and the student is included, they didn't have a supportive family, right? And that's a real reality for a lot of queer students. And by choosing to come out and transition meant severing family ties and potentially becoming homeless. Those are huge challenges for a lot of our students, and we have to remember that students are not financially secure most of the time. And so it's really important to connect students with appropriate resources. One that I'm a huge fan of in the city of Calgary is Skipping Stone. They are really, really great at not only providing supports around medical transition, but also social and emotional supports. And they can help folks figure out things like housing and stuff like that. So they're a great option. We also have a lot of really amazing queer positive counselors in learner success services. I always do a big shout out to Lindsay and Alana in LSS, who have both been amazing. And actually, we collaborated early on in terms of making sure we had access to gender neutral bathrooms on campus. And so that was a bit more of a struggle than I anticipated it to be at first. But I think by collaborating with multiple parts of the school and explaining why that was necessary, it created, again, more space for students to feel included. The only other thing I would say on add on this is don't underestimate small signs of inclusion either that people think may not be huge. So during Pride Week, we hand out rainbow lanyards, and that has been huge for a lot of students, that visible symbol of acceptance. Or even just saying that you are an ally at the beginning of classes or things like that. You know, it doesn't have to have in every class, but like the first class of a term, things like that. So those are some of the things that I do.
Those are some really great pieces of advice. Thank you so much for your time today, Matthew. We really appreciate your perspective. And if we can summarize some of these things or model that behavior, create a space for your students and make sure that you're sending them to the appropriate supports that need to be in place. And I think as educators, as instructors, whether we're queer, whether we're allies, we do need to also make sure that we're aware of the resources that could be out there. So
absolutely. It's really glad to be here, and I hope those things were helpful. And if not, I'm always open to being reached out to as well. So I don't mind my email being included as well if you would like to share that.
Wonderful. I can certainly do that. Thanks, Matthew. All right, everyone. Also joining us today is Emily Albertson. Emily is an instructor in the School of Global Access. Welcome to the podcast, Emily.
Thank you so much.
So, Emily, can you tell us a little bit about what you do in the School of Global Access?
Yes, I teach in our practical stream, which is our stream for literacy learners. I teach level 5A, so those are higher level literacy learners. Our students have interrupted formal education, somewhere between 0 all the way up to maybe even 10 or 11 years of education before they come to Canada. But they're often refugees. They've often lived through very difficult traumatic experiences. And they've often, even the ones who have had 10 or 11 years of education, there have been gaps in their education, or it's been under very difficult circumstances. So we think of it as teaching language and teaching literacy at the same time.
You must have a huge amount of diverse learners in your classrooms from all over the place, different walks of life.
We absolutely do. We have diversity in terms of nationality and first language, in terms of age, from 18 to 80, in terms of gender and gender identity, in terms of faith. We have a lot of diversity, also a lot of neurodiversity in our program.
So it sounds like when you're teaching in a program like this, inclusion is probably one of the things that should be at the forefront in terms of your teaching practice.
I think it's the most important thing. I think the most important thing is that any student who walks into my classroom or metaphorically walks into my online classroom, who's learning with me, feels like they belong here. And I think that's important anyway. But with literacy learners, I really want them to know that school is a place for them, that they can see themselves as educated people, that they can go after an education themselves. So inclusion is key.
So do you have any examples of how you incorporate or how mindfully you incorporate inclusion into your lessons, into your curriculum, into your classroom practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of at the heart of everything I do. I mean, of course, I have curriculum and I have outcomes that I have to meet, and we have assessments, but what I really do is try to teach the people who are there in front of me, and I try to teach all of them. So I want to make sure that everybody in the class feels like there's a space for them in the class. So I'm very respectful of my students. I think we all are. I think that's really important. And I try not to make any assumptions about who they are or where they're from or where they're coming from in terms of what's happened to them and their own learning. And I also try not to make any assumptions around behavior. And so when somebody behaves a certain way, let's say they're late to class, just as an example, I try not to make assumptions like, oh, they don't care about this program or they're not prioritizing their learning, because there's usually a much deeper story. And that much deeper story is true for anything that's happening in the class. So I'm trying to kind of create an environment where we all feel okay being there. And that also comes, I know we're talking about LGBTQ and we're talking about gender and gender identity, and that's part of that as well. And I have a lot of students who come from very traditional backgrounds. They haven't had a lot of education. Some of them have been in refugee camps for very long periods, like decades. And so when I'm creating this inclusive space or co-creating along with my learners, trying to create this inclusive space, I'm also very, very gentle. And I think that's important. So when I'm trying to, for example, gently expand our ideas around gender roles, if somebody says something that I might actually find personally sort of offensive, I try to meet it very gently and kind of provide another perspective without being confrontational, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that does make a lot of sense, because my thoughts were, well, how do we best broach those difficult situations that might pop up when we're trying to deal with a subject that students don't necessarily have a lot of background in. So you've got, again, really, really diverse perspectives, and I like that idea of approaching something with a gentle attitude. Do you have any examples or sort of ideas on a time that might have happened with you?
Sure. Actually, it's a few years ago. It was before we moved online. Just as one example, I had a male student, who's from Ethiopia, and he's a lovely man. He's funny and bright and had quite high speaking and listening skills and very, very low reading skills and very low writing skills. But he was a strong student in the class. And we were reading something. I think we were reading something, and it probably had a gay couple in it. And so he expressed some of his views, which, were quite homophobic, really, but sort of stated as a matter of fact that this is simply the way it is. And so I sort of said, what I often do with the entire class is I say, what is the situation in Canada? Because I am also kind of a settlement worker, right? I'm sort of one of the first points of contact for many of these students as they come into Canada, or one of the first points. And so what is the situation in Canada? What's the language we use? What's the legal situation? What are the rights? What's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Kind of bring in some of those things. And then I had an opportunity, just kind of one-on-one a little bit later while everybody was working. I was chatting with him, and I really was quite gentle, because I think perspectives shift and broaden over time. And I wanted his contact with me to be a positive step in that direction, if it could be, because I really do want to change his mind. I mean, I grew up with a lesbian mother. Homophobia is is very, very hurtful. And so I really did want to change his mind, but I wanted to do it in a way that didn't kind of cause a direct confrontation and sort of preserved our relationship as instructor and student. So I was just sharing with him kind of some of my views, and just very gently. And then we went back and forth a little bit, and then a little bit later he said to me, you know, I think for me, it's not for me, but I think if other people want to be gay, that's okay. And I actually think he came a long way in the course of, you know, a couple hours of class time and a short conversation with me one-on-one. I think he came a long way, and I think that speaks volumes to who he is. But for me, I sort of treasure that moment in class because I feel like some real learning happened, and some real communication and some understanding happened.
That's a huge step.
It was big. That's one of those moments that stays in my heart. Yeah.
That's a really bright moment too, because I think that's something I have to check all the time, is my internal biases, and to make sure that I'm not going in with a bias already against a certain person or a certain background or a certain whatever, just, you know, because you come from there, you must hate LGBTQ. Like that's not the case. It's that humanity that we come down to, right?
We have to come down to that humanity, and I also do understand. I'm not surprised to hear homophobic views from my students because it's really common. I'm not surprised, and I do try to detach a little bit my own personal feelings from, okay, how can I best offer a different perspective, offer a different way of thinking, kind of just broaden the topic a little bit for them. And it's with my students in particular, and, you know, like I think he probably had about 2 years of education in his life, or 2 years of formal education. Like I don't want to come at them in a hard way. I don't want to judge them for what they think. I don't want to be in a combative situation with my students. I also don't think that's productive. I don't think that's going to be helpful. And so it's gentle, and it's providing alternate ways of thinking. And I think because we do have quite respectful relationships in our class, and I think that's mutual. I think they also have respect for me, and we have, you know, good relationships, you know, friendly relationships. They trust me, I trust them. And so I think because of that, they can also think, okay, Emily thinks this, and I like her and I respect her, so maybe it's worth considering. And that it's the approach I take. It's probably also a way of protecting myself, because my mom came out when I was about 6, and that was in the early 1980s. And my brothers and I, and my mom, of course, but we were the ones in school, we faced, you know, a lot of hateful comments. We faced violence. You know, it wasn't an easy time. And so I'm also mindful of protecting myself, I suppose, from being hurt.
I definitely take that approach as well. And so I think that what's happening, like from the examples, I feel like I was going to ask you, you know, how can we be good allies to our diverse learners? And I think that you've just given a lot of examples of how to do that. And what really stands out is when you say we have this mutual respect for each other, and we don't want to judge each other on you know, what our backgrounds or what we think or our belief systems, because if we come in with judgment for the learner, then that shows the learner that they should come back with judgment.
Yeah,
right?
I think so. That's right. And I have what I've experienced with the population that I've taught, and I've taught in this program about 15 years. So I've had, you know, most of my teaching is with literacy learners. I have not had a lot of people who openly identify as LGBTQ. I'm hard pressed to think if I've had any students who openly identify. But we also can't make assumptions about who people are. And so, and they also might not have the language to express who they are in English or even in their own languages. They might not have that yet. That's more my experience with my students. So I'm also mindful when I'm, you know, not letting homophobic comments stand, when I sort of gently offer my opinion or a different perspective, that's also creating space for anybody in the classroom who may well be LGBTQ, whether they're openly identifying that way or not. And I'm always mindful that there's got to be people in the room who are being silent. And just because they're being silent, it doesn't mean that I need to be silent. I can, especially as the instructor, I can say things.
And likely in the many years of teaching this population, I'm sure you have had LGBTQ students sitting in your classroom being silent. Yeah,
guaranteed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today, Emily. I really appreciate your perspective, and hope to chat with you again on a future podcast.
Thank you so much.
All right, our next guest is Alex May, and Alex is going to join us to talk a little bit about how her school works with inclusion, inclusive language, and diversity. So Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Dara.
This is going to be fun. So if you just want to tell our listeners kind of what you do, what you teach, where you teach.
Yeah, so I'm an instructor in the Early Learning Childcare program in Community Studies. I specialize in preschool care and working with students with exceptional needs. And with that specific focus, we have a lot of conversations about inclusion, including inclusion for exceptional needs and disorders, delays, disabilities, but also for the many different ways that people can exist in the world and how we can work to make sure that all peoples feel included in our spaces.
That sounds really great because, of course, starting from the ground level, if we start teaching our kids about inclusion when they're just itty bitty, they're going to grow up to really embrace that as a part of who they are, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's not something that they'll have to unlearn in order to be able to relearn. If we grow up in an inclusive environment, it's all we've ever known.
I see that with this next generation coming up too with my kids as teens, and they're already a lot better at that than I ever was, and I've had to retrain myself a lot, right? So
yeah, they give us hope.
They do, they really do. So can you tell us a little bit about what your school has been doing, like some initiatives that the Early Learning and Childcare programming has been doing to make sure that inclusion is at the forefront?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that we have found is that sort of these traditional dyadic and heteronormative ideas of moms and dads and two parents at home are just not accurate or real for the way the world looks. And we've also really had to pay attention to the ways that gender diversity impacts parenting. And so one of our big shifts has been changing from languaging of mom and dad to gestational parents, pregnant individuals, non-pregnant parents, and supportive partners. And so that very simple shift to the type of parenting that is being done allows us to include pregnant dads and partners that might be working through surrogacy or polycules, where you have more than two, sometimes many parents in a household. It also helps with families that are experiencing kin care that might have aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, all sorts of different relationships in a household. And so by removing languaging of mom and dad and parents, we are able to talk to the families of the children that we work with much more inclusively.
I think that's a really great point, is talking about the fact that parenting in and of itself doesn't have to be like a binary function, right? Because
there's so many different ways to parent. Yeah.
Yeah. And you look at all the families out there, and not everybody is mom, dad, kids. And I mean, my family is a prime example. I have a wife and I have kids from a previous relationship. So they have their dad and we have our different household. And it's just like, how do you explain that to people? And it's become one of those weird things in the world where it's like, okay, I'm tired of explaining my family dynamic to you. So by teaching these kids early on, maybe that's something we can stop doing.
Yeah, it's almost one of those things where we remove any sort of prejudgment or expectation off the top and build in the expectation that you just ask a person about their family and they will self-identify. Oh, my moms are called Carol and Stacy, and my grandma takes care of me most of the time, and they will just identify their own care relationships. And you don't have to do that awkward, like, sorry, I didn't know about dad. You know, there's no backpedaling. It's just, okay, this is what your family looks like, and here's how we move forward from there.
Yeah, and there's so many diverse families if you think about the structure of Canadian society in general, just with our ridiculous amounts of, not ridiculous, amazing amounts of diversity.
Yeah, we're very lucky in our plurality, and it's, you know, it's one of the most important and foundational things about our society, but it's one that we need to do a better job of recognizing and uplifting, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done here. So speaking of work to be done, if we can, you know, take it into like what do you do as an instructor with your students in the classroom, and what might that look like?
Yeah, so one of the very first things that I do to kind of lay the groundwork in class is when I get roll call in my class list for the beginning of the semester, I will make the disclaimer off the top that I'm going to read off their registered names, but anyone at any point can interrupt me with a preferred name or a nickname or the correct pronunciation, because we know that sometimes the registrar's office still has dead names or non-preferred names. And that provides the opportunity right out the gate for people to self-identify and to provide their names. That builds in kind of this level of what I hope is security for our students to come to us and talk about other things. And then we also make a set of classroom agreements in the first class of, you know, what are our collective nouns? How do we refer to ourselves as a group? I have this really bad habit of calling a group of people guys. Hey guys, hey guys, let's, you know, and that just doesn't work anymore. And it's a terrible habit that I have to unlearn. And one of the things that I do to do that is ask everyone out the top, what should we refer to ourselves as? Do we want class, folks, y'all, everyone, friends, colleagues, fellows? There's so many great options to choose from, and we'll decide as a class what to refer to ourselves as. And then that just, again, sets the tone that this is an inclusive space, that we're making accommodations, that we are waiting for people to self-identify. And it just kind of proceeds from there.
I think that's awesome. And because I catch myself doing that all the time. Hey guys, how are you feeling today? Like, oh, how was the test, guys? And stuff like that. And I catch myself, I'm like, nope, folks, or something that's a little more inclusive, a little less gendered. But I think a lot of times we don't really realize how significant our language is on the groups that we're working with, right?
Yeah, I think that nomenclature in this world of what people talk about, like identity politics, is not important and front of mind because it's like the easiest thing to tackle. I think it's because it's one of the most important things. And really, like, it's the mildest of inconveniences to try to accommodate. Like, you might catch yourself and have to make an apology. Ugh, sorry, I said guys. I meant to say folks. And everyone knows that we are all learning so much about society and the different ways to be and move in it right now. I think everyone is, you know, flexible and patient, and now is the time for all of us to be playing around and experimenting with this new language and this new nomenclature, so that we're not left in the dust and fossils on the flip side of this when we've all got it figured out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you mentioned correcting yourself, because I think that we're all going to make those little things. And once we start being aware of those blips and stuff like that, it's totally a great example, actually, to go back and say, you know what, actually, that wasn't the right word. I wanted to say this. And it's a piece of learning for the learners, too.
Totally. Catching yourself is great. Allowing yourself to get caught, offering that option right out the gate, saying, you know, if you catch me saying a term that it's like a no-fly term, please call me out on it. I am happy to be called out, and I appreciate you taking that effort. And I'll just correct myself when you do so. And then you also build a culture of people being able to acknowledge it's not this big deal to get called out. People only call you out if they care and want you to do better. And so it's actually a gift that people are giving to us if they call us out and ask us to help change.
That's a great way to look at it. So I think one more thing is maybe you could talk a little bit about how the industry is growing and changing in terms of this inclusion idea.
Yeah, do you mean the college industry or early childhood education?
I mean, maybe let's go with early childhood education.
Sure. I think that, you know, there's a lot of old learned behaviors. So much of our industry really is shadowing more experienced educators and learning on the ground from people that have been in this field for a long time. And so there's old things that kind of perniciously move forward, referring to a class of, all right, boys and girls, it's time for us to move outside, or all right, ladies and gentlemen, let's pack up our stuff. And so I think I see that sweeping across the industry, that people are really making an effort to use more inclusive collective nouns. Friends is a really popular one. All right, friends, let's move forward. And that also, again, just like sets the tone for what this group of people is convening to achieve together. And I love what that means. And then, like I said, ways to talk about families and waiting for people to self-identify before making any assumptions about what any given family might look like. That's, I think, first and foremost in most of our registrations, in our meet the teacher days and coming to school and having, our first kind of interactions with families. It's, don't expect a family to look any given way. Wait until each family comes in, and then you have something to build from.
I love that. That's really a positive direction. And if we're thinking about inclusion in general, or inclusion for LGBTQ2S+ individuals, and just the diversity that's reflected in our Canadian population, I think that's a really wonderful trend. So thanks so much for sharing your experiences and your thoughts with us today. I think the listeners are really going to appreciate your perspective, and even knowing a little bit more about what we do in early learning and childcare. So
yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
My next guest today is Austin Deck. Austin is a learner who is a second-year nursing student in the School of Health and Wellness, and he also happens to be the Director of External Affairs for the SABVC. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Now, I should have asked this previously, Austin. I want to make sure that we have this correct. What are your pronouns?
So I use the pronouns he, him.
He, him, perfect. So I should have asked you that beforehand, which is good practice to make sure that you're starting with the person's pronouns. So just from a learner perspective, we're super happy to hear as faculty feedback from our learners on how we can make our practice better and more inclusive and create a classroom experience that is going to be the best experience that we can give to a learner. So with that in mind, Austin, I'm just curious if you have any advice or have any thoughts on how instructors can best support queer students in their classes with like the way they teach, the way they relate, or even in their curriculum, the assignments they give or the materials they use.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. When you sent me a little tidbit, I did send that out to our Pride Club just to get some feedback, and it was very much in line with what I was thinking. And we have a great community in our faculty already. They already do so much. And so what I would say to that is just adding and making sure that we're keeping up that consistency with it. So like you did with me today, you asked my pronouns. That needs to be kind of an important thing for every class as well. And we know that it's hard to keep up in this virtual world with making sure you remember each person. But I think making that more of an effort, and also teachers or instructors saying their pronouns as well at the beginning of introducing their classes and things like that can make a huge difference. Another thing that I have realized is there is a lot of LGBTQ2S+ history that could be involved in the curriculum. There's a lot of things that could be discussed. So for example, when I took my English course in my first semester, my instructor actually made a point of talking about the Stonewall riots and things like that. And that was amazing. It was huge for me. I also know that other people don't have that opportunity with their instructors. That would be a huge thing, just in making sure to not just curb it out as something that needs to be talked about from a advocacy standpoint, because I think that often we get pigeonholed into this standpoint of I can only speak from the nursing perspective, but in nursing we talk about, okay, you're going to experience a lot of people from a lot of different places and things like that, and we talk about how to care for the LGBTQ2S community. And we also don't talk, however, about the contributions from that community and the changes that they have made. So
I love that you brought up history and bringing history of the queer community into the classroom, because as you said, it's not where we have to pigeonhole a certain group as advocacy only. And I think that's a really valid point to bring up. And there's so much history that we're just learning how to incorporate into our classes. Why wouldn't we want to incorporate queer history as well, especially in a Canadian experience? Because it's actually pretty rich. I don't know that we always know that.
yeah, and also speaking about those local resources that we have available to us. I mean, I know that a lot of people don't like to talk about some of the resources because they think that there's a stigma to nightlife and kind of the misconception that the dangers and risks and things like that. But a lot of the time, these queer spaces are a gathering place for people to come together and kind of experience that history come to life in the present day. And so I know that we have, fortunately in Calgary, we have a couple of queer spaces that before the pandemic were operating quite nicely. And it would be nice that if faculty acknowledged them even and talked about how their significance in Calgary, their history in Calgary, things like that.
And just really bringing it in that that's a very inclusive community.
Yeah.
And there are definitely parts of it that do facilitate the gathering of the queer community, right? So how do you think, again, from your perspective, and even if you had any other input from the SABVC, how do you think inclusion itself should be best supported in your classes? And then when we can take it from the classes into the school community as a whole, what would that look like to you?
Well, a lot of the times, I want to give the benefit of the doubt because we don't know what we don't know. However, in this day and age, we are learning so much about what microaggressions are. And I think microaggressions is a huge thing that I personally have witnessed a lot of. So just realizing that the lifestyle of someone in the queer community may not necessarily fit the lifestyle of someone that, or the regular student. Now, of course, I know that's looked at in our school because we have such a high international student ratio, which is amazing. However, we also have a lot of closeted queer people due to the international influx. We also have a lot of queer people that may not fit into that normal ratio. So for example, even things in classes like saying, have your partner do this. Maybe they don't realize this, but in Calgary, the queer community is very small. And so the opportunity to have a partner might be very small. And so, and not saying that assuming people are in a relationship is offensive, but I also think that it's good to recognize that that resource of having a partner at home may not be something that we're all used to. Having a family life, having a kid, things like that may not something that everyone has. So.
That came up in another conversation that I had with a faculty member from, I believe it was from the early childhood development, talking about how families, they're not one way, right? And there's so many different ways to look at families, and we really can't make assumptions on what people's backgrounds are. And so supporting that with our language and the way that we're speaking to people, I think is also really, really important, and how we're using the part, and don't make assumptions about the backgrounds and where they come from, right?
Yeah, and especially in this, so for during this pandemic especially, there was examples that I heard of people that were closeted that were being asked to get their partner to help them with an assessment or something like that for filming, or for anything like that, for a big something. Now, getting this partner over would mean that they would break quarantine. It would also mean that they could possibly, now obviously they can invite family, but if you're an international student whose family is back home. And so a lot of people felt like it exposed them. There was comments saying that it made them feel like, it's kind of making me feel like I have to come out in a way. And so we don't want that. We don't want to put the expectation that you're supposed to be in a relationship. You're supposed to have this. You're supposed to. There shouldn't be any shoulds.
I
Yeah.
like that. There shouldn't be any shoulds.
Yeah.
I think that's a great phrase to take away from. Now, from your time as a student in Bow Valley or in any other, school situations, do you have any, have you had any experiences where you have felt either really included in a community, or have there been some areas where you felt marginalized as a learner in a specific population?
Well, I can say that I felt very much included in this community from day one. I've seen so many examples where even this, for example, being on this podcast today, being asked to be part of this, that's inclusion. And so I really have felt that everywhere. There has been very minimal times that I felt marginalized as a student. However, the few times that I have felt it, surprisingly enough, has been an external party outside of the faculty and the faculty not stepping in to protect me. So for example, I was at a external practicum situation and I had a staff member come up to me probably day 4, so we didn't really know each other well. She came up to me and said, I have a son just like you. And I said, oh, what do you mean? And she said, just like you, and did all these feminine traits.
Right.
And then she laughed with me and she goes, he's going to be amazing just like you. And I was like, oh, thank you. And I thought that was, as much as it came from a compliment point, this is where we go back to microaggressions. It wasn't appropriate, especially with the power dynamic that existed there. And so that was in front of the staff member. And later in our debrief, I did say I didn't feel that was appropriate. And they agreed. There was nothing that they said at that time. And they said that it was on me to speak up. Now, I understand that as an individual, we have the power, we have a voice. However, when I'm part of an institution where there's a power dynamic, I feel like there's a little bit of responsibility on that person to be protecting me as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So stepping in and sort of advocating, saying, no, this is not appropriate behavior.
Yeah.
You talk about microaggressions, and that's a really interesting thing too, because that's one of those sort of new terminology coming up in the last little while, and a lot of people are like, okay, microaggressions, but they are very real.
Yes.
And unless you have been in a situation where you have felt othered,
Yeah.
you might not always see those microaggressions. And as a queer instructor myself, I do tend to find that I have those little things, and usually they just kind of slide off the back, but sometimes they really do stick in your mind, and you kind of wish that somebody else was there to just sort of like back you up a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And microaggressions are like you said, it's such a new term, but there's micro invalidation. There's so much to that where you can say something without intention and have it mean something else to so many people that are listening.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think just catering that language to a neutral positivity and being conscious of those, what can be said, even having, I've known people that have had a disclaimer. I do not mean anything by this. I'm still learning. I'm ignorant. Like things like that can go a long way than you being confident in what you're saying and offending people.
Right. And that's actually, that was going to be a question that I asked next, was what can an instructor do if they have accidentally, without the intention, done something that makes you feel othered, marginalized, singled out in some way? What can they do to make that better for you?
I would say it comes down to an apology. An apology goes a long way, but also asking how they can do better, asking for a perspective. Obviously, I can't speak for the whole community. People can't speak for the whole community in that situation, but they can speak to their individual circumstances. And I think that collection of insight will start to add to experience. So just going that extra mile to not only just say, I'm so sorry that happened, but also saying, how can I, in the future, if this has happened, what would you have an instructor do for you? Just so that we can teach as well, because we have a voice in that, being an advocate for ourselves. So
yeah, and I do find that the best kind of instructor-student relationship has to be one of that mutual respect. And there shouldn't, in my practice, I don't love the idea of like a power position. Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, and the worst
level
thing that can happen is defending it. I think the worst thing you can do is defending it. I think there's an understanding of the misconceptions and the lack of education and awareness. I think there's an understanding there. I think there's also an understanding that there's a responsibility in this new day and age that if you're going to be working with people, you get educated, you make sure you are responsible for yourself. So when you send an email saying, I'm so sorry I said this, I had no idea, I haven't done the work yet, this is what I'm used to, I haven't had this ever said to me before, things like that, don't try to defend it. It should just be, I'm sorry, how can I do better? It should, I think defending it, that we go back to micro invalidation, invalidates the experience.
Right. That's a really great point. So
Yeah.
just apologize and learn, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. I just want to thank you so much for your perspective today, Austin. And I know that a lot of staff members and faculty are going to get a lot out of the things that you shared with us today. So thank you for being a part of the podcast with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And we welcome SABVC Pride. Our club always welcomes faculty and students to be a part of it. So it was just an awesome time to be a part of this as well today. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, so another guest that I would like to welcome to our podcast this episode is Jordan Witzel. You might know the name Jordan Witzel from his work in the community, in the media, and his work with veterans and LGBTQ. Welcome to the BVCFA podcast, Jordan.
Thank you. I've been listening. I've been excited to be asked and finally join you. It's great to talk about this.
After one episode.
But no, I mean, I know you personally, and you do great work, and it's always fun to engage with all sorts of people doing great work in our community, and that includes you here, to just broaden voices. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today. I think that's going to be my message is, I know you have so many hopes of some of the conversation we might have, but it's about broadening voices and hearing those that usually don't get heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think that in a lot of the conversations that I've had with faculty members on the podcast today, with we'll hear some other conversations with learner. We talk a lot about creating space. We talk a lot about being visible. We talk a lot about being an ally, using language correctly. And I know you to be a very visible ally in the community for LGBTQ. So I'm just wondering, like, if you can speak to any of those things, or if you have any thoughts on things that you've learned from your work in the community.
Yeah, I think I have always, I don't know if admired, well, admired is the right word, but this is going to sound strange, those who have faced an incredible amount of discrimination. Do you see why I think admired is probably the wrong word? But I am in awe. It stems from an incredible amount of empathy that I feel in my bones for those who face discrimination, face daily difficulties in all sorts of ways, and they don't feel like they're ever seen. Mm-hmm. And this is perhaps going to sound like an odd connection, but I am someone who in my entire life has been seen. And I'm very fortunate, and I have always reflected on that fortunate nature of my life. Privileged, call it privileged. That's what it is. I've always been seen. I've had an enormous amount of opportunity afforded me because of my family background, because of the education opportunities I had as a young kid, the schools I attended, the sports I played. But the visibility I always felt was, this is my odd connection, is I was a pretty good athlete as a kid, and it got me places. But I did always sit back in games and practices in sport and go back to that word, admire. I admired those peers who got in for one play, who never got to touch the ball, who never got to even go up to bat or run down the field for the big catch. and yet they just desperately wanted to be seen for even a little moment, get out there for one play on the field, have the coach simply tap them on top of the helmet after the play and say, thanks for contributing. And I would sit back as someone who received so much attention for being a star, and I would admire that those kids stuck with something.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that is a connection in life. It's a life lesson. It's how do some people who are never seen, who never get that chance to be heard, how do they stick with it? How do they stick with the game? And I am in utter admiration for that. So that has been in my adult life the driving force for don't just sit back and be impressed by those people and their strength and their courage and their determination to stick with the game, but do something for them. Take your visibility, which is an incredible privilege my entire life, the amount of opportunities I've been put up in front of, and do something with it. Don't just make money, make sure my family's healthy and happy, and pack it in and have a fun weekend. But really do stuff for those that don't get those opportunities.
That really speaks to a lot about what I feel like I do in my job as an instructor, because there is, as you say, a level of visibility. Yeah, I mean, you're literally leading a group of people in or facilitating learning in some way. So using that visibility, what could that look like? I mean, do you have any examples of things that you've done or some ways that you've used your visibility in order to?
Yeah, there's a moment where we have to recognize where we go back to that sociological term of power structure, right? And first off, how fortunate are we to be living in these times where enough people have stepped up and said, on both sides of that social power structure in all of its different forms, and accepted it and recognized it and tried to make changes for it. But there are different moments where we'll all find ourselves on either end of that power structure. And so let's take your situation, for example, as a teacher. You have, there's a moment, I mean, in so many ways in your life, Dara, knowing you personally, knowing your life story, you have rarely had that opportunity to be on the, let's call it the top end of the power structure. And when you do get there, there has to be a recognition. Again, in your situation, you've got to that point because you're educated, you are intelligent, you are an amazing teacher, you have an incredible amount of insight into the world, and so you are a wisdom keeper, and you're there now on the top end of the power structure to pass that on, and you're the right person for that. I'm just using you as an example. There are other examples, and I think we'll touch on some of mine too. But in that moment, I think those of us that find ourselves on that top end, I know that's probably not the right term, but it's the best way for us to visualize it here, right? You're not there to suddenly be the be-all, end-all of knowledge. And I think there's knowledge and there's wisdom, and where wisdom comes in is that when you're on that top end, are you taking a chance to lead from behind? And are you raising people's voices, and are you listening to them? So in a simple teaching classroom setting, are you pausing instruction to truly hear the students? Are they interpreting your message? Your message is wasted if you're up there just being someone of knowledge and spitting it out. But if you're wise, you will pause, you will listen. It may slow down your objectives, but you're leading from behind, right? You may lose a whole week of objectives. And I know that's difficult in teaching. But the outcome is so much greater. And it's not only greater, I think we have an argument for the education system with younger kids in Western society of, yeah, but we're trying to push everyone to gain the same set of knowledge, and some fall behind and some get ahead. And I hear parents talking about, what if we go too slow, or we change the objectives to, let's use math as an example. What if we we give these kids all these different ways to solve a math problem, and then none of them are learning anything the right way. It's everyone's got all these different methods.
Yeah, I've heard that one too.
Right? But there's a perspective there that every kid in that classroom has the opportunity to gain. And if you're in that moment, if your child is someone who has succeeded at all of the math strategies and now they're thinking, oh, I'm getting bored and I'm falling behind because the rest of the class is slowing me down, well, your kid has a chance to really learn something about the bigger picture of life. And for a moment, even that kid's getting an opportunity at being at the top end of a power structure. And how do they react to it? Do they become a tutor in their classroom as a 10-year-old even? You're giving them that chance. That kid has an opportunity to recognize that they can lead from behind, that they can slow down and hear other people who are having troubles with a lesson. So, you know, for a moment here, I'm really focused on a micro situation, but it applies. It applies to you as a teacher being able to slow down and say, okay, how can we adjust our sails so that everyone is seen and heard, because we all have an opportunity to learn things when we adjust the sail on the boat.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, and I think about demographics in a place like Bow Valley, where it's a community college, it's an access college. We're looking at, one of the things that we look at is the idea that all learning counts, and as such, we have an incredibly diverse group of faculty and learners, and so I think some of the things that people maybe, well, I certainly struggle with, is making sure that each of those different perspectives has space in the classroom. And I do often find, I mean, we're talking more specifically about LGBTQ, but like it applies to all walks of life, where someone sits back and they might not see themselves represented in a lesson. They might not see themselves represented or being given space in that particular classroom. And it's not necessarily because we're trying to exclude people, but then it feels like an insurmountable task to make sure that we are including everyone, right? And I know that you've done lots of work in the community with allyship in different organizations and different aspects of representing. In your takeaway from some of your community work and hearing others' voices, like what piece of learning do you think that you could pass on about some of those pieces of work that you've done?
I think it's a matter of realizing that too often in my younger years, I have entered a situation out of empathy. I've tried to impart my thoughts and my opinions and, well, guys, this is the right way to do it, or have you considered this because this worked for me? But as I really dove into giving myself and my energy and my visibility to people who don't have those opportunities, and specifically, you know, in recent years, taking on a massive project to support the LGBTQ community with huge success. But when you ask me what I learned, the reason it was a huge success is because I stepped the hell back. And I didn't offer my opinion, and I didn't speak because I don't know what any of that is about. And I actually selfishly went into it as a hope of, well, let's see what I can learn here. Not the hope of, I mean, there was a secondary case of, maybe I'm saying this wrong. I really did hope to raise voices and give visibility in the community. But you know, I'm a sociologist too, and there's always a trade-off, and we all do something for something, totally, for a selfish reason. And mine was that I wanted to turn a corner in my life and learn new things about the person I was. I was starting to grow already, and I think I was uncomfortable with the growth that was happening in my 30s, and I was unsure of which was the right direction to pursue that growth. And so I leaned into it. And I leaned into that with my support of military veterans and their families. And believe it or not, I say this, and I don't think I ever articulate it properly to people that I say it to, and so I probably won't hear. But it's the same objective. And people will go, wait a minute, so you've spoken up. Now, first off, I'll say I haven't spoken up. I have given my visibility and my power and my privilege to the LGBTQ community to raise voices.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done the same for folks who have joined the military and suffered as a consequence. And some of those folks made a choice. Some of them didn't. They had no opportunity in their life. And my brother-in-law is one of those. He had no opportunity in his life. What the hell am I going to do at 17, 18? And he joined the military.
Mm-hmm.
And the mental health impact that has had on the rest of his life through his experiences, I empathize with that. I see a parallel in it. While those living in the LGBTQ community don't have any choice in their life path, they are who they are. I have empathy for it, that because of who they are, they suffer certain consequences in our society.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm articulating where you can see a parallel sort of path here of the folks who I've tried to give my energy to. There is discrimination for those who retire from the military after giving all of their time and effort and all of their health to the public.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you want to agree with it or not, I don't agree with war. I don't agree with the military. I don't, but I support the people who, regardless, were involved and have suffered consequences because of it.
Mm-hmm.
I know there are massive differences, and I know I'm skimming the surface, and I know we could have a whole other conversation that separates the two.
We could write a book on that.
Yeah. But what I have learned is that when I have found, quote unquote, success in bringing a community together, it is because I've led from behind.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the listening. That is the raising voices up, repeating the message, not changing the message through my eyes, but simply hearing the message and repeating it, standing up for people. And that is what it has looked like for me, but that is leading from behind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. And that makes me think of the word amplification.
Yes.
Right. And you're allowing space for people to tell their stories or be who they are. And then amplifying that and not letting it go through your own lens or your own perspective or your own experience, but just amplifying those voices.
And I know I've mentioned to you sort of off of this program, that's a big thing. How are you going to amplify or soften the message that you've integrated yourself with someone else? Someone, in a one-on-one exchange, someone comes to you with something. They need to be heard. They need to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And are you diving into that exchange by trying to offer your opinion and your perspective? Or are you saying to yourself, what can I learn from the fact that this person has come to me with their experience?
Mm-hmm.
And I think on a one-on-one exchange, that low level, that very micro level social exchange, that's the beginning of it. Are you amplifying them or are you amplifying yourself in that exchange?
Yeah. And I think as a person who is a caregiver in many aspects of my life, I always want to offer advice, right? Like that's the default.
Yeah.
Like, how can I fix this for you? But that's a really great lesson to step back and just hear someone, right?
I saw something this morning. It was a meme and I saw it and I loved it. It was an hour ago. And it was, are you in the feeling stage or are you in the fixing stage?
Yeah.
And we have to recognize that with people because there's always a balance. People, you'll have an exchange with someone or you're in a role or a situation. And you do have to measure that. And that's the fun part of being human.
Mm-hmm.
That little measure in a moment's time, in the flash of a moment, where you have to figure out what stage are we in here? Are we in a mix of both? Are we in a feeling stage where someone needs to be heard, to be seen, to be amplified? Or are we in a fixing stage where someone is genuinely looking for advice. They're so broken that they're looking for advice. I'll tell you this right now. No one who is gay or lesbian or bisexual, transgender, queer, any of it, no one is looking to be fixed. They're looking to be, maybe for the first time in their life, or maybe for the 900th time in their life, they're looking to be seen and heard.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the feeling. Are you in the feeling stage? And I know that's not, someone might say, oh, it's not like I'm always just stuck in my feelings and emotional. That's not what I'm saying. It's the someone who is someone in that community. You have to come out daily, and so you have to be heard and seen daily.
Mm-hmm.
You're not looking for opinions. You're not trying to be fixed. And the more that we can bring our community together to realize we're not all out here running around to fix each other. That's not the point of living.
Yep.
And you will grow yourself so much more if you start to get into the recognition that most of the exchanges you have with people are the feelings stage, and the what can I learn from this, by embracing their feelings, by embracing their position, their space, and just hearing it.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of food for thought there. And I think that's great, because that's the point. That's the point, because we don't need to have an answer all the time. It's where let's explore, let's think through this. And I want to, as we're wrapping up today, just to encourage people to take some really great lessons here from my good friend Jordan, and just think about how can we apply those to greater situations. And they can be within our classrooms or within our educational settings, but they can be outside in the world too. And think about the idea of amplifying, the idea of the feeling as opposed to the fixing, because I know that's definitely something that I think about on a very conscious level all the time. And yeah, there's definitely a lot there to unpack. So I really appreciate your time with us today, Jordan.
Yeah. Can I wrap it up in my thought process here?
Please do. That sounds great.
Because people will say, okay, but come on, at the end of the day, why'd you invite a meteorologist? I'm a scientist, and I mean, I'm a sociologist too. I've done both paths education wise, but here's the thing. It is about human connection. And for me, it is about the scientific method. And I know this will sound very introverted and quirky and nerdy scientific, but I encourage people to go about their exchanges in life with humans by being inquisitive and forming a question. And then from that, you form a theory. So sure, come up with your own opinion in your mind of another person or situation. But then you investigate, which means you collect data, which means you don't impart any of your bias on it. You investigate and you collect, which means you hear people and you listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
And then you challenge your theory. In science, you don't take that data in order to twist, to fit your opinion and prove it right. Science is all about proving yourself wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So after the investigation, you apply it to your theory and go, how was I wrong? And that's your summary. And that's how you learn. And that's how you come up with the next question. Human connections, though, that's what it's based on. That's what living is all about.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I tell kids. Be inquisitive. Go out and be inquisitive in the world around you.
Yeah. We should all be inquisitive. Doesn't matter what walk of life we're in. Doesn't matter what age we are. And being inquisitive does lead to learning and growth, right?
And that's allyship, because let's go back to what you're trying to explore here, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how people are going to feel like you're on their team.
Right. Yeah, because an ally isn't just somebody who says, yep, support ya.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time today, Jordan. I think
thanks, a pleasure.
everyone's really going to appreciate what you have to say. So
thank you.
Well, here we are. That's I really hope that was a lot of food for thought. Right? The biggest goal of presenting all these differing voices is just to get us to think. Inclusion, however, is really important. Okay. I know that as a queer instructor myself, this issue is close to my heart. But the biggest goal is just to hear different voices and to give space to them. So it's an important part of our practice at Bow Valley. I've witnessed the depth and breadth of this in many areas of teaching and learning, as well as in policy. Inclusion shouldn't just be a trendy word, right? Trendy is not, it's not going to stay. Inclusion's got to stay. It can't just be a word. It's got to be embedded into every part of our practice. For me, it's not actually a position of we should practice inclusion in our teaching. It's the position of we must practice inclusion in our teaching and in our work. This is a foundational building block for a vibrant and thriving student body, a vibrant and thriving faculty and staff dynamic. And indeed, it must be the foundation for our whole institution. This is what will lead us to the growth and thriving that is most certainly in our grasp. So I'm going to leave you with this thought today. This is a quote from Harvey Milk. It takes no compromise to give people their rights. It takes no money to respect the individual. It takes no political deal to give people freedom. It takes no survey to remove repression. We can do this every single day in small ways, in large ways. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments on YouTube and Podbean. And if you want some more resources, check out the links sent in the email with this episode, as well as in the comments on our YouTube channel. And tune in next time for more You're on Mute, the BVCFA podcast with yours truly.